We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the Darkened Hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. With me today, Nick Fielding. Nick Fielding is a journalist and author. He has worked for the Sunday Times, the Mail on Sunday, and the Independent. At the Mail on Sunday, he broke the story of the renegade MI5 officer, David Shayler. And for the Sunday Times, he covered the story of Richard Tomlinson, an MI6 whistleblower. Fielding is also the author of the introduction to Tomlinson's book, The Big Breach. He was launch editor for the online magazine China Outlook, and he writes the Circling the Lion's Den blog about Afghanistan. He is the author, together with Yosri Fouda, of Masterminds of Terror, which contains the only interviews ever given by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his co-conspirator Ramzi Binalshibh, to which we will be the basis of our interview today. Welcome to the show, Nick Fielding.
Pleasure to meet you, Adam, and delighted to be here.
Sure. Well, when did you first become employed with the British press?
I've been a professional reporter all my life. I trained immediately after university, and I worked pretty much on magazines and as a freelance for a number of years. And then around about late 80s, early 90s, I began working in Fleet Street as a reporter for the Independent newspaper, where I covered the whole story of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, Bcci, and its collapse. Amazing story at the time. And I moved on from there to the Mail on Sunday, where I was eventually became chief investigative reporter, broke a whole number of stories there. And I moved on from there to the Sunday Times, where I was senior reporter. And I reported a lot on 9/11 and various other issues there. We had a lot of big hits also at the Sunday Times. I left the Sunday Times sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. It's quite difficult working, I think, for publications which have got a very clear political bias. And Murdoch, I don't like Murdoch. I don't like Murdoch's press very much. And I was much happier working as an independent. And since then, I worked a lot in Pakistan, even Afghanistan. And in more recent years, I've concentrated on Central Asia. I now write books about Central Asia. And I travel extensively in Central Asia. So that's roughly my background.
Just a follow-up to that question. You say you did a report on the Bcci Bank. What did that report show?
Well, I reported on Bcci and the collapse of that bank for more than 2 years. And I broke a whole number of exclusives. It was me that first brought the whole issue of Capcom, the secret kind of intelligence agency controlled organization behind Bcci to light. And I broke many of the stories. I went to Pakistan. I tracked down various former bank officials and doorstepped them at home in Rawalpindi and Islamabad and places like that, and showed what a corrupt bank this was. Its senior staff were highly corrupt, but also they managed to corrupt a large number of people through the way in which they're able to distribute funds, give people soft loans. And this is where they operated. They operated right out in the open. I'll lend you 10 million and you pay me back someday. It was kind of a bit like that. That's how that bank worked. It was a very, very, it was also, I think we can say now pretty safely, it was operating within the curtilage of various intelligence agencies, not least the Saudi intelligence agency, probably American agents, et cetera, And in fact, I think that Bcci was the bank that financed the West's response to Afghanistan. That's what it was used for, effectively, to organize the transport of arms and munitions to the Mujahideen who were fighting, and to paying off all the various people that needed to be paid off around the world. So yeah, a filthy, corrupt bank, and extraordinary times. It's almost forgotten now, but it was a massive story at the time. Yes,
it was. I'm a little bit familiar with Bcci Bank and Operation Cyclone, which was the CIA operation in Afghanistan with Mujahideen. Who is David Shayler, and what did your investigation uncover about him?
Well, I was first approached by Shayler, well, via a third party, as it happens, probably in 1996. And I was asked to go to a meeting in central London in a public place, and was introduced to somebody who told me that they were a serving intelligence officer. I mean, that was really, I mean, it's almost the dream of any journalist to be given sort of access to a person of that standing. Very, very seldom happens. And this person told me that they had been working at MI5 for a number of years, and they were very unhappy, and they had a number of stories which they wanted to publicize. I was actually extremely cautious initially because, you know, everybody and their dog pretends that they want to be they're an intelligence officer and they've done this and that and the other. And so, you know, one has to be extremely cautious. And the first thing I had to do effectively was due diligence to make sure that what was in front of me was what I thought was in front of me. In other words, that he was who he said he was, and that he was also not using me for an intelligence operation. You know, that's the other thing that one has to worry about. You know, am I being fed stuff in order to make a particular point? So I was very, very cautious on that particular point as well, because, you know, I thought that was a possibility. And eventually I was able to work out that that was not the case. This was somebody with a genuine grievance. Whether the grievance was genuine or not, I don't know, but he genuinely felt a grievance. And he was willing to say a lot, and also, you know, in effect, to put his own career, well, his career, as soon as we published, of course, was going to be over. So he decided to get out, and in fact, the only way that we could really make that work is to get him out of the UK prior to publication, because he would have been immediately arrested, and possibly quite a number of others, myself included, would have been arrested. So we got him out of the UK. We hid him abroad in France for a number of, well, almost 2 years, until he was eventually, and we ran our stories, and the stories were quite dramatic in that, you know, he made the point that MI5 had been collecting intelligence on a whole number of people that, you know, were a waste of time, you know, like punk groups, like the Sex Pistols. And you know, so, I mean, a lot of it was banal, almost, absolutely banal, but nonetheless significant in the sense of why on earth is you know, a major intelligence agency in the late 20th century collecting information about pop stars as if they were a threat to society. And so this was important on some level. He also revealed that MI5 kept files on a number of senior government officials at the time, senior government ministers. I mean, I'm talking about well, Blair, of course, Mandelson, Jack Straw, the Home Secretary, a whole number of people, and he revealed that there were files on that. He also revealed, for example, that there were a number of mess-ups in relation to, he'd been on the desk in Northern Ireland for a time, and therefore he knew something about British operations in Northern Ireland in relation to the IRA. And he revealed that a number of those operations had gone badly wrong, and that had not been in the public domain previously. They'd gone badly wrong in that people who were being followed had been lost, and they'd gone on to do things which they should have been stopped from doing, etc., etc. So there was certainly a large public interest element in a lot of these stories. I won't say in everything, but in a lot of these stories, and that was our criteria. I mean, in fact, I mean, Shayler provided very serious information that we could not possibly publish because it was not in the public interest, if I could say that to you. These are things which, had we revealed, people could have suffered. And I mean, maybe been killed by a terrorist group or somebody else who could have possibly worked out how certain information had got into the hands of the intelligence services. So we had to be extremely cautious, and we were very, very cautious in terms of what we decided to publish. My bosses didn't believe me, actually, when I first went to them and told them that I had somebody like this. They didn't believe me, and it took me a year to convince them to get stuff into the paper. And all that time, I had to keep Shayler warm, if you like, keep him cooperative and happy with the circumstances and guarantee his safety, etc., etc. All a whole raft of measures that had to be put in place. So this was a massive, massive operation in the end. And you know, we got our front page. We got our first front page on sort of Shayler's revelations. The second front page was knocked off the front of the paper by the death of Diana, actually. And you know, at midnight we had to scrap the front pages. We got one edition away, I think, on a Saturday night for a Sunday newspaper, and then she died around midnight in Paris, and then the whole paper was rewritten. So it was kind of, it was a bit stop and start, but eventually we got it out. I mean, there was pandemonium. You cannot, well, maybe you can imagine, but it was pandemonium. Everybody in the world wanted access to Shayler, wanted to know what he was saying, wanted to get to him, etc., etc. And the government was involved. The government were threatening our newspaper with injunctions. In fact, we ran a blank page. We ran a blank page after we were given an injunction. And I remember my editor at the time standing in front of the newsroom and saying to the whole newsroom, shouting actually, I've wasted my entire life to be able to run a page like this. So, I mean, it was dramatic days. And of course, you can imagine for a journalist like me, any journalist, I think this would be extraordinary events. So, you know, that rumbled on for a number of years. I was with Shayler in Paris when he was arrested by the French intelligence services on behalf of the British. He was put into La Santé prison in France. I was with him when he was released from Santé, and when he came back to England, and so on. And after that, I think sometime after that, we parted our ways. He went his own way. He and Annie at the time, his girlfriend Annie Machon, who'd also been a serving intelligence officer, gradually, I think, you know, in my view, they went out onto some kind of very strange limb, in that they began more and more to become more and more closely involved with the 9/11 conspiracy theories, and they began to speak initially in the UK, of course, but then more and more widely, certainly in Europe. I'm not sure if they ever went to the States, but they certainly traveled extensively promoting this idea that there was a conspiracy. And because Shayler was a serving intelligence officer, and he had made one of the revelations he'd made, which we had some evidence for, was that MI6 had been involved, for example, in an attempt to kill Gaddafi. They had provided training and possibly equipment to the Libyan Islamic fighting groups, one of the jihadist organizations operating in Libya, in order to kill Gaddafi. And we took a long time trying to stand that story. So Shayler had some genuine stories, which were his. When it came to 9/11, which obviously happened a long time after he's out of the intelligence services, 4 years, at least 4 years after he'd left. However, if you introduce somebody to a crowd as, this is Mr. So-and-so, former intelligence officer who revealed this, that, and the other, a lot of the audience are going to say, well, I believe him. Simply because that's, you know, he's got a background and he's got a proven track record. No matter what he may say, you know, I've seen a dog with 4 heads. Well, you know, your kind of instinct tells you that's possibly wrong, but some people are going to believe that because they're going to say, well, he knows stuff that we don't know because he's been on the inside track. You know, he's worked for one of these secret organizations that we all fear and loathe and whatever, and therefore he really knows the way in which the world works. And a lot of conspiracy theorists, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure your audience knows, live in a very strange world. You know, they live in a world where there are no facts tacking them to the ground. Everything is free floating. nothing is based on cause and effect or anything. It's just floating information which may or may not be true and doesn't necessarily relate to anything else. And if you live in that kind of world, you can make statements about what's happening, and you're not particularly bothered about whether empirically it can be proven to be the case. That's neither here nor there, because you say, well, the powers that be, the inner secret state or whatever it may be, is so efficient that it can hide all that sort of stuff from us. And, you know, in the end, you get self-fulfilling prophecies. And I would say that that's roughly the territory in which people like Shayler, Mashon, and others exist, in a fairly free, a world floating free of fact and information.
It's a problem here in the States, because with the events, especially for the events of September 11, 2001, is that we have many competing fringe conspiracy theories. I say they're fringe because there's almost like this layer of conspiracy. You have conspiracy theories questioning the malfeasance of government, and then you have fringe conspiracies, as I label them. For example, no planes hitting the World Trade Center or Pentagon. That there were no hijackers involved, or that the World Trade Center came down by nuclear explosion or whatnot. These are the theories that are competing. And it's unfortunate, because these are the theories that are permeating inside the truth movement itself. And there's a lot of good people in the truth movement still, but they're few and far between, unfortunately. But even after you broke the story with Shayler, I mean, your reputation is now growing inside the country in itself. And so, how did you come across Yosri Fouda?
Yosri and I have been good friends, actually, partly because of Shayler, because Yosri was the London bureau chief for Al Jazeera at the time. And they were also, like everybody else in the world, were keen to report on Shayler's revelations. And so because I was able to put Yosri in touch with Shayler, that was where we first came in touch with each other. And from then on, we worked quite closely together. I liked the work that Yosri was doing. I knew what he was doing. I knew what kind of a guy he was, and I knew the lengths he went to stand up his stories. And so, what happened? If I can say, if I can move forward a little bit at this point, but I mean, if we can go on to talk about what happened in relation to 9/11. Yeah. Yeah. Just initially, anyway, let's just broach this initially. He came to me one day in the spring, late spring, maybe early summer of 2000. Let me just think when this will be, 2002, and told me that he had some extraordinary information, and he eventually revealed to me that he had just come back from Pakistan. I knew he'd gone to Pakistan. He told me he'd just come back from Pakistan, and he told me that he'd done interviews with the two main conspiracists involved in, and conspiracies in the proper sense, involved in planning the 9/11 attacks. I was absolutely astonished when he told me that. And he also said that he was actually finding it quite difficult even to get his own organization to believe in the truth of his story. Part of the reason for this being is that although Yosri had filmed everything in that meeting, he had not been allowed to walk away with the tapes, because they were terrified that there would be something in those tapes which might identify where they were. The two conspirators being Ramzi Binalshibh and KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They were extremely cautious. He'd gone through a whole rigmarole in order to get to see them in, I think we all know this now, but this was in Pakistan. And he had had to swap cars and been blindfolded and taken to an apartment, and so on and so forth. So it had been a very, very complex operation to get this stuff, but he had been in no doubt. In fact, I remember him, when he told me the names, the first time he told these names, I knew nothing about these names. I'd never heard these names before. They were new to me, as they were new to everybody. And certainly, I believe, they were almost entirely new to the intelligence services. And certainly they did not know the structure of the way in which this attack had been planned. They had no knowledge whatsoever about how it had been done. And what happened, of course, in the interviews that Yosri did is that they explained in great detail. They actually had all the flight manuals, the training manuals with them, all the maps showing the routes that they had planned to take with the aircraft. They gave him all the names of all the people that had been involved in the 4 different aircraft, told them who they were, gave them backgrounds on them all, so on and so forth. A massive amount of detailed information. However, even then, I mean, when Yosri explained what he had, there was some resistance to running the story. And so we decided the best way to get this story out, we now had an extraordinary story. It was his story primarily, but the question was, how do you get this into the public domain? And so our strategy was to publish this story in the Sunday Times as a front page lead story plus a big explanation inside. And once that came out, Al Jazeera would then follow it up. They wanted the confidence that we also believed it and we were willing to publish it in order to allow them to publish it. I mean, you think these things are straightforward, but they never are straightforward. And it was, again, it was yet another struggle. And I also had to convince my colleagues at the Sunday Times. I had to bring Yosri in. We had to go through everything in great detail. And we were able to reconstruct, I mean, eventually bits and pieces. I mean, he got the soundtrack eventually of that interview. He got the soundtrack. He was promised the film. But eventually when the emissary came to see him, the go-between, who was to negotiate him being handed over the film, that guy wanted $100,000 or something ridiculous. And Yosri quite rightly refused to pay it. And so we've never seen that film, but I believe the film exists, and I believe probably it's in the hands of the US intelligence agencies at this moment. I've got little doubt about that. They've never confirmed it, but there are various things that have come out since which lead me to believe that that film has been recovered. So somewhere, it remains to be unveiled in public, but somewhere that film is out there, and it is kind of the crown jewels in some respects, although I don't think we need it these days to verify what Yosri has said. I mean, the remarkable thing, and I don't want to dictate how you run your interview here, but the remarkable thing about what the interviews that Yosri did is that even after he'd been waterboarded so many times, the story that KSM delivered and what is believed to be absolutely the case differs in not one jot or iota from what he told Yosri Fouda voluntarily right at the beginning. That story remains the true story, and it was never contradicted. There was never extra information that came forward that showed that he'd not been given the full story or anything else. So I remain confident that everything that Yosri was told in that little apartment in southern Pakistan was the truth. And those two guys were actually very, very keen to brag about what they'd done, because at that moment, no one knew they had done it. And KSM himself, I think anybody who's followed him and knows anything about him, there is a big streak of vanity in this guy. There's a very strange streak of vanity that runs right through the middle of him. And, you know, he wanted to do it. You know, he was a freelance operative pretty much at the time when he was recruited to do this for Al-Qaeda. He never really became a member. For a start, he was a Pakistani. And they didn't want Pakistanis. I mean, you know, that organization is an Arab organization. At that time it was anyway. And nobody from outside of the Saudis in particular would ever get anywhere near the heart of it. So KSM was always on the outside. He'd always been on the outside. If you recall, you know, he had planned a whole series of bombings in other places. He had tried to organize the bombing of a number of American airlines flying to the Philippines, for example, and various other places. He was a kind of a very strange fish in some ways, in that maybe he had his own reasons for doing this. I mean, part of that came out of his family tradition, and there's a story about that which we could go into, but the reasons why he chose to be like that, hard to explain. And Ramzi Binalshibh, I think, was he was trusted by Osama bin Laden, but also he was fascinated, I believe, by this extraordinary intellect and intelligence of KSM, who was a very, and remains, I think, a very, very clever man. I think anybody who's seen any of the stuff that's come out of Guantanamo, that he's both written and broadcast, cannot fail to be amazed by what this man has done. I don't want to hero worship him, but I think he has proven that he is a formidable person.
Yeah, just to because you answered a couple of questions already with that summary. So let's talk about his family profile, which is coming out of Baluchistan. There's a lot of questions about whether the clan that he was with and his nephew is Ramzi Youssef or Abdul Basit Karim, who's the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So yes, there's that link. And you talked about the airline plot of 1995, which is the Bcci plot, which is but to implement hidden bombs in Timex watches underneath the seats of planes, and I think it was 11 airliners. And there was a number of different sections to that plot. I think there was one. There was originally they were going to assassinate Pope John Paul II. Because he was visiting the Philippines, but they couldn't get to him. And he was a replacement because they wanted to assassinate US President Bill Clinton, but his security detail was too strong. So they chose Pope John Paul II. Then there was a third unit to that Bcci plot, was to intentionally crash a commercial airliner into CIA Langley headquarters.
Yes.
But during the interrogation of one of the Bcci plot plotters, Abdul Hakim Murad, Philippines investigator Rodolfo Mendoza had basically just given him a hamburger, and Murad basically became more friendly to him and told him about an additional plot to the plot itself that many people weren't aware about, and was that they had sleeper cells inside the United States who were willing to hijack a number of planes. I think it was about 10, and crashed them into select US targets. And then Mendoza basically gave his interrogation reports to the FBI, and he claims that in 1996, they didn't do anything with it. Talk us about his family background.
Well, yes, and just in relation to what you just said, by the way, I think they were planning to hit the Sears Tower. Yes. And they were planning to hit various places in LA and some places on the West Coast. That was the plans. KSM Baluchi, which in itself is something. Baluchistan is technically, legalistically, it's part of Pakistan, but it regards itself, and there has been for many generations a strong insurgency against Pakistan by Baluchi nationalists. They don't regard themselves as Pakistanis, and at the same time, they have, and part of the reason for this, if you look at the position of Baluchistan, it's on the southern coast, if you like, of Pakistan, onto the Gulf there, facing the Arab countries. And many, many Baluchis over the years have traveled across there to Oman in particular, and to some of the other states, where they have always been, if we can think of them as kind of the NCOs of the Arabs, they have been the people that did the bidding of their Arab bosses, and that was the role of the Baluchis. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. That's the Oman Rifles and which was a British regiment, and others like this were mostly staffed by Baluchis, and they were very used to working with Arabs, and they understood how to play Arabs, if I can put it that way to you. They had this kind of symbiotic relationship, and they could use Arab money, prestige, etc., to maybe do things that they were interested in doing. KSM himself was actually brought up in Kuwait, where I believe his father was a preacher, in a Brotherhood mosque. And a lot of these people, don't forget, a lot of the Al-Qaeda early membership came from the Brotherhood. And as particularly the Egyptians, they were very, very fundamental to the early structure. If you remember, obviously Zawahiri and people like this are Egyptians, but most of the leading core of people around bin Laden were Egyptians, and together with a mixture of Saudis. And I think that that Brotherhood connection was an important one, and they like what happens at a certain point is that they feel that the Brotherhood is not the vehicle that's going to sort of liberate Islamic territories. It's not radical enough, and they all begin looking for something else. And what happens with, I think, with KSM and his clan, and that includes Ramzi Youssef, who is an extraordinary character in his own right, a very, very successful terrorist operative. They begin effectively freelancing, initially looking for things they could do themselves, raising their own funding for these operations. And then I believe that really what happens is they subcontract themselves to Al-Qaeda. Once they're finally settled up in Afghanistan, that's the backyard of Baluchistan, of course, and there's a very close connection because the Afghans and the Baluchis share a mutual hatred of the Pakistanis. And so there's that element there, which is quite important, I believe. And so KSM is introduced to the inner circle. And I don't think they necessarily take him that seriously to begin with, but they give him the space to develop his idea. And I think because he's got so much practical experience and he's such a clever thinker, and he comes up with, he's worked out this idea eventually. It's not about smuggling bombs on board, it's about using the bloody plane as a bomb. That's the great breakthrough that they come up with. And it's so simple and so straightforward. And that requires a completely different kind of operation. It's all you need to smuggle through is those little craft knives. That's pretty much all they had, as far as I can work out, in terms of weaponry. Something which they could hide extremely simply, and then it was a question of taking over the planes. And if you had the idea that you could then control the plane and fly it, you could use it as a massive bomb. And that was I don't use the word brilliance in any disrespectful way, knowing full well what it did to people, but that was a brilliant breakthrough in terms of this kind of warfare, if we can call it that, terrorism warfare, whatever you want to call it. It was a brilliant breakthrough, and KSM was the guy that was responsible for that. So he's a very unorthodox character in this, and there's nobody else quite like him in the whole constellation. We can put everybody else into a different category, really. You know, the Arabs are all very, very different to this, and okay, they're very brave fighters and all of that. But the brilliance and the thinking that went into planning this operation was something quite remarkable. And clearly, I mean, it was so far beyond what was expected by the intelligence services that even when they got bits of information like the stuff that you say they were offered, they could hardly believe it. You know, so that's how far ahead they were, like two jumps ahead.
Sure. You know, there was an incident in France in 1990, I want to say 4, where there was a potential hijacking of Air France 89, where the Algerian Islamic group basically stormed the plane, and their intentions were to, which they didn't reveal until later, the intention was to crash it into the Eiffel Tower. But the French guard basically stormed the plane and killed the 3 people and saved everybody on the plane. Now, I always wondered if Khalid Sheikh Mohammed ever got that idea, but according to Peter Lance, who wrote the book 1,000 Years for Revenge, he basically wrote that after Ramzi Youssef had been arrested in Pakistan for his role in the 93 World Trade Center bombing, and it was revealed that the Bcci plot was no longer in operation, one of the operational people that was involved with Bcci had related to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed the intention of crashing the planes at CIA headquarters. And that's where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed got the idea to, instead of now when they were looking for bombs on planes, they wouldn't be looking for a person to hijack the plane and crash into the World Trade Center. And what happened was, if we're to believe the allegations made by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi Binalshibh, is that they put forth the idea to Osama bin Laden in 1999 and said that they wanted to hijack 10 planes. And bin Laden said it would be too much. And so he agreed to 4. And it involved, the people involved. But at first he said he would think about it and tried to get, as you mentioned before, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to swear bayat, which is loyalty to al-Qaeda. Yes. He didn't. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed really did enjoy that freelancing attitude. He does mention that.
Yeah.
That he didn't want to have like a boss or a leader to tell him what to do. And he was free to travel to the Philippines, Indonesia, and Qatar, whatnot. He liked that freedom that allowed him to do that. Was that another reason why he reached out to Yosri Fouda? Because he considered Yosri Fouda to be reputable enough because of his background, and because he could have chose anybody else, but he chose Yosri Fouda.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to make very, very clear to you, Adam, and it's a really important point, okay? KSM chose Yosri Fouda because he was the most prominent investigative reporter in the Arab world, with a track record second to none. Now, what is remarkable in a sense about the whole question about understanding what happened on 9/11 is that Yosri Fouda has never been given the full credit for breaking the story about what really happened. And that, I believe, is because he's an Arab and because he was working for Al Jazeera. And it was, well, I can call it racism. I think it's a form of racism that he was never given the full credit. If that had been some white guy from New York or London, believe me, they'd be king of the hill and would still be king of the hill. And Yosri has had to fight all along, even to get acknowledgement. I mean, everybody in the what I can say, sort of the intelligence world and in the sort of FBI and that, they all know the importance of Yosri. They all know that he got it right because they got nothing else from KSM besides what Yosri delivered. Right? They all know it, but the rest of the world has not acknowledged, and he should have received far more credit for breaking what is. I mean, to interview the 2 primary conspirators, no one else has interviewed anybody. Let's face it, no one else has interviewed anybody of those conspirators. Not one single person has been interviewed except what Yosri did. And that is a phenomenal achievement. He put his life in their hands. Anything could have happened. And a remarkable act of bravery in the first instance for a journalist, a working journalist. He was not sympathetic. He was not seen as a sympathizer. They trusted him because they believed he would not distort their message. That's why they trusted him. And that is quite an unusual thing in the Arab world, believe me, because there are very few journalists of that caliber operating. And I feel that I want to make the statement very, very strongly to you that Yosri Fouda broke the biggest story in the world at that time. And it's still one of the greatest stories. And it's an amazing story, just the story. If you read our book, I'm sure you have, you can see the risks he took and the way in which he persevered. Because not only did he do that, he then traveled around the States. He went to all the flying schools. He interviewed all the instructors. He went to the houses where the conspirators had lived in California, in Florida, in Boston, etc. He went to the hotels. He went every single place and interviewed face-to-face those people himself. So he did all the groundwork. And he didn't just rely on being told a story. He actually then set out to stand up everything they had told him to prove that it was true. And he achieved that remarkably. And that's why that story has stood the test of time. It's not been faulted. No one has ever been able to criticize it. You can say, well, I don't believe it because it's all, it's the establishment and blah, blah, blah. But, okay, give me a concrete criticism. No, you can't, because there's nothing you can fault about the work he did. And everybody has come since, Lawrence Wright, every single one of them, they all know Yosri. They all know the debt they owe him. I wish it was more openly acknowledged, and hopefully it will be one day.
Yeah, listen, when I read the book itself, I was amazed at the fact that here's a guy who actually went and interviewed Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Binalshibh, and no one's ever done it before. And I'm wondering, because I've interviewed authors like Terry McDermott, and I'm going to be interviewing Peter Lance in the future, where they know who Yosri Fouda is, and just like you mentioned before. And I'm like, well, why isn't this guy basically like front page news at one point? I mean, the only thing I've heard from Yosri Fouda, there's actually videos on YouTube that was uploaded by, I think it was by Al Jazeera, about the report of 9/11. And I think there's one that's translated to English and the rest is in Arabic, and I don't know Arabic. So like, I'm amazed at the fact that here's a guy who's basically going to be forgotten in time, and he broke the biggest story ever regarding the attacks of September 11th. But I want to touch with you about the risks he took, because that was another thing I was amazed at. I said, you know, now there was a reporter, Daniel Pearl from the Wall Street Journal, who basically went and trusted an intermediary to get him into contact with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Instead, he was captured and he was brought to a safe house where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had murdered him. And this had to have been in the back of Yosri Fouda's mind, considering that he is a reporter and considering they do bring about a good ransom, and that the very fact that he could have been killed, was that something that he sure thought about before?
Yeah, and I just want to say, incidentally, I was in Pakistan when Daniel Pearl was kidnapped. And I was also reporting at that time, obviously from Pakistan, and I was trying to make some of those connections. And when that happened, I was required by my newspaper, by the Sunday Times, to travel everywhere with a guy with a shotgun standing next to me and sitting in the car next to me, which, as you can imagine, cramped my staff substantially. But that was what was required because the threat of being kidnapped was so high. So I know just how serious that was, and therefore it puts in context precisely what Yosri did, because he had no guarantees at all, and he simply relied on the facts that they would treat him in the way in which they said they would treat him, namely with respect, in order to get through that. And I think it was a remarkably brave thing for him to do, and I think it, you know, emotionally it was extremely shocking as well for him when he came back from that trip. And when I first met him and he kind of downloaded to me what had gone on, he was still in shock. I mean, it was kind of you know, if you imagine that weight on your shoulders pre-publication, that's a huge weight on anybody's shoulders, and anything could happen at the point. You know, you had to consider, were the people that didn't want that story to come out? You know, that's another question. Were there those, you know, and therefore was he at risk in that respect? The potential dangers to him were legion. That's what I'm saying. And so it wasn't just that they might kill him when he was there, but somebody else might do something to him because they were unhappy with the fact that he was revealing and you know, revealing something which held, you know, for example, the Qataris. We know that KSM had a very close relationship with the Qataris. He worked there for them as a water engineer for some years, and he clearly knew people, and he clearly got funding for various things. I won't say specifically, but he clearly got funding while he was there to help him do some of the operations that he was involved in. And so it wouldn't necessarily have been in their best interests for the story to come out in the way in which it did. So Yosri took a lot of risks, a real lot of risks, in my view.
When he conducted the interview in Karachi, there was a number of questions that he asked that were quite illuminating. One in such was that the targets themselves. And one of the targets originally planned was a nuclear target, in which Yosri Fouda asked him about the specifics of that, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that they left them out because things would get out of hand for now. I always wondered what that meant, because it was such a vague statement. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I wonder, it's actually hard to answer that question, but I wonder actually what was going on there was that if there had been an attack on a nuclear power plant, the event in itself would have overwhelmed anything to do with why it had happened, because it would have been a massive international crisis. And you know, the fact that that had been done by a terrorist attack, that's neither here nor there, because you've got to deal with the massive crisis that was there. And that would lose sight of what they were trying to do, namely to establish al-Qaeda as being the focus for Islamic revenge, or whatever you want to call it, on the West. And I think that event would have been too big to do that. So they kind of scaled back slightly. I mean, don't forget, of course, they were going for the capital. And I believe that was the fourth target. The two towers, the Pentagon and the Capitol, was the run of the show. And that would have been dramatic in itself. But if they had all been destroyed in the way in which it was intended, well, that would have just been that. That would have been a lot of rubble. But a nuclear explosion or something like that would have been another thing entirely. And I think I can see the logic of that. I mean, it was not clearly explained, but when he said that, that's the way I took it.
He stood there for 2 days. And at the end, you spoke about the items they gave him, a number of items, which were, I think, some CD-ROMs, mini cassettes, including a will made by one of the hijackers themselves, a documentary, what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed called The New Crusades, and a video of the beheading of Daniel Pearl.
Yes.
And I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed told him to distribute the tapes to Western news agencies, including the French. So again, what became of these items?
I think all of those items were effectively, they were handed over to the authorities, and I'm guessing they ended up in the hands of intelligence agencies, one thing from another. I think Yosri handed everything over to his employer, and they would have gone from Al Jazeera then. And I think we know, actually, don't we, that the director of the CIA was in discussions with the Sheikh who owns Al Jazeera.
Oh,
that was
yep. Mm-hmm.
That conversation, I think, is on the public record, or at least the meeting is on the public record. Mm-hmm. I believe that's when they were told for the first time precisely what had gone on, and that Yosri had got the story. And I think that was the kind of shock moment, a real big shock moment for the. Was it what was his name?
George Tenet.
George Tenet, exactly. Mm-hmm. It was him that got the story secondhand, as it were, not directly from Yosri, but they got it secondhand because Yosri, you know, as a good reporter, told his news organization precisely what he knew.
Yeah, because Tenet basically does remark that he was in shock that a reporter basically was the one who had met Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Binalshibh, which put like I think you mentioned this before, it was almost like embarrassment for the agency because it's the CIA.
Yeah,
meanwhile,
exactly.
they've been following, I mean, they've been trying to get to know who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was from the mid-1990s. Now, the only other person that I know of that knew who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was, because he was a complete mystery to most people, was an FBI agent out of New York named Frank Pellegrino.
Yes, another name.
Yes, he had chased Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Meanwhile, New York, the counterterrorism unit itself basically didn't support Pellegrino in this sense, and he only gave him one assistant to go and investigate this because they said that it was a waste of time. There wasn't much information about him. Nobody really knew about him, and it said that you're basically chasing a ghost, as an example. And Pellegrino actually went to Qatar, and they had Khalid Sheikh Mohammed surrounded, but then Qatar basically
got him out.
Right, basically they helped him out, and he escaped and whatnot. And I think I still have the New York Times clip it where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was alleged to have traveled to Pakistan and Israel in 1996, 97, that time frame, and then he went to Afghanistan and met with bin Laden and proposed the idea of the planes operation as it was. Okay, so hey, Fouda comes back from his trip and he basically returns to London, and with him, the story of a lifetime, really, no exaggeration. Yes, the only man to meet and interview Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Binalshibh. What was the initial reaction to the story that he's telling?
Well, as I said to you, there's a degree of skepticism initially,
right?
Because, you know, who is this guy that's got this story, and why has he got it? Why haven't we got it? I mean, there's all of that goes on, and plus the fact that everybody was concentrating on Qaeda as an Arab organization. And why have you got this Baluchi, Pakistani, whatever he is? Why is he involved in this? And, you know, nobody could quite understand that. So it took a little while to get those things in order. And the basic point, I think, is that once Yosri was able to explain what he had done and explain what he had seen, people then caught on very quickly. And the story was an absolute sensation, obviously, when it broke in the Sunday Times. It was a massive sensation. And I think it was 2 days after Al Jazeera ran his report, which took it to the Arab world and the rest of it. And then it did the rounds, as it were. I don't believe, as I said to you before, I don't believe a single word of Yosri's story has ever been successfully challenged. Nothing that he wrote, he's a very meticulous man, nothing he wrote has been challenged successfully. It's entirely as was told to him, without embellishment by the people that did it.
Did he come to you, or did you go to him about wanting to write a book?
We decided on the basis of the Sunday Times piece, which broke the story, that the best thing to do then would be to put this out in English. And because I'd already been published, I had a number of books to my credit and so on. I knew that well a little bit. And also I had some other stuff to bring to the story. You know, I had interests in various other people who were operating around Al-Qaeda at the time, other Pakistanis, for example. And I was very interested in the Pakistan connection. And so I could bring that to the party, if you like. And I also knew a lot about what had been done through London. You know, I had written, for example, I broke the story of bin Laden's sat phone. I was able, this is extraordinary. Nobody realizes this, but, you know, well, didn't realize it at the time. After the bombings in East Africa, you know, you had the trial in New York of some of the people involved in that. Well, I followed that very closely from the UK, and I tracked down a lot of the documentation. And one of the documents that I came across was a list of phone numbers. And it subsequently turned out that these were the phone numbers called by the sat phone that had been provided to bin Laden for use in the early days of Al-Qaeda, when he was trying to set it up from the mid-90s, from 96, 98, thereabouts, that kind of time period. And what I then did, I reverse engineered all those numbers, and I worked out where the numbers, who had been called. And, you know, for example, I found out that a lot of calls had gone to a phone box on a public phone box on the corner of a road in northeast London, which was around the corner from where bin Laden's supporters in London had their office. And so, you know, we were able to make these extraordinary connections. And a brilliant, I say it myself, but a brilliant piece of straightforward journalistic investigation. You've got a list. Let's see how we can exploit this list and what's on the other end of it. And it turned out to be a gold mine, absolute gold mine. So, you know, there's stuff like that where I was able to bring to the party, and we worked out a division of labor, and we wrote it in a particular way which encompassed the investigation that Yosri had done both in Pakistan and also in the States and elsewhere. In fact, also in, you know, I actually later than that, I went to the Philippines and dogged the trail of KSM in the Philippines. So, you know, we did lots and lots of background really to make sure that we knew what we were talking about, and we had as comprehensive as possible account of how the conspiracy had been organized. And if you recall, I mean, they gave him, KSM and Ramzi gave Yosri details of the codes they'd used in their phone conversations, transatlantic phone conversations, where they talked about two sticks. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Being the towers.
Right.
And, you know, they had this whole little sort of secret vocabulary, which they used for open source phone conversations, which clearly fooled everybody because nobody cracked it. When you see it, when you know afterwards what they're talking about, it all makes perfect sense. But that kind of detail that they gave him was part of what convinced me that this was a genuine story, you know, because this was too complex to make up, and it all made perfect sense. And they gave time, date, and place for everything. So we were able then to, as much as we possibly could, back up that factual material with our own research and stand it up as much as we possibly could, and develop a coherent and comprehensive narrative.
I think the code was 2 sticks, a dash, and a cake.
Correct.
That's right. When you think about it, it's like very simple. It's like, but what you're looking at is like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, you brought up about the satellite phone of bin Laden. And this is something that I took great care to detail. And I've done videos and even done a podcast about the NSA intercepting bin Laden's satellite phones in the mid-90s, where he was living in the Sudan, for example. The NSA had begun wiretapping or listening to the encrypted phone calls made on that phone. And one such number kept coming up, and it was a number that was tracked to a house located in the capital of Yemen, it's Sana'a. And this house later would be known to be owned by a person by the name of Ahmed al-Hada, who was an associate of bin Laden from the Afghan Soviet days. And this later became the Al-Qaeda communications hub in the mid-90s. And frequently, a visitor would come to the house, and it was ironically, it would be Khalid al-Midar, who basically was one of the hijackers of American Airlines Flight 77, because he married the daughter of the owner of the house, right? Hoda al-Hada. And so the NSA began wiretapping the phone calls of that house, and from 1996 to 2001, and it just, you know, it begs the question of what they were listening to, you know, all throughout those 5 years before the attacks. And, you know, I actually messaged Thomas Drake, the former senior executive of the NSA, and I knew this wouldn't be, you know, it'd be a pipe dream, but I figured I'd ask. I said, what would it be possible to file a Freedom of Information request, the transcripts of those phone calls? And he said that good luck. He goes, you know, they're protected under executive order. And he gave me the number. I forgot the number. And he says, but we still have a trial, you know, in Guantanamo that, you know, it still hasn't happened. And he says that it's a 25-year wait. So I figured if I'm living that, you know, long enough, I could probably file and see what they were listening to, if that's even possible. And all the stuff that they were talking about in those phones, I can only imagine. But yeah, all right. So 2 weeks after the meeting, Ramzi Binalshibh is actually located and captured in Karachi. And it was nearby the location of where he met with Fouda. Now, was Fouda initially blamed for the capture? Because
yes, he was. He was. Mm-hmm. And that was very serious, because it was suggested that he was a traitor and that he had allowed himself to be tracked, and that's how they got him. Yosri has always denied that, and I for a matter of record, I believe that. Okay, whether he was tracked without him knowing is another matter. And who's to say? I don't know. But undoubtedly, very rapidly after he did the interview, they were on to Ramzi. KSM had gone off by then, and he was living up country with his friendly Pakistan army officer.
Yes.
You know, which is another question altogether. And, you know, the same relationship possibly as Osama had with the Pakistan military, in which they kept these people in their back pockets for the day where they would be useful. And that's precisely how they've operated the whole way through. So I don't have any doubt about that. But yeah, Yosri was undoubtedly blamed, and I was worried for a time that somebody would come after him to kill him, really, you know, for that happening. But not much was said after that, because I think anybody who knows Yosri knows that he would have. I mean, there was a $20 million reward, I believe.
Yes.
Yosri's never collected that.
Yep.
You know, so presumably, had he been, he would have been quite within his rights to go up and claim it.
Sure.
You know, so I don't believe that he in any way collaborated with any tracking, although I think it's entirely possible that he may have been tracked by somebody or by equipment that he was not aware of.
And then shortly thereafter, on March 2nd, 2003, finally, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is captured by the ISI and the CIA's Special Activities Division without much fanfare. With Ramzi Binalshibh, there was a shootout, but with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he basically was captured in a house he was staying in and whatnot. But it was an informant who basically called about where the whereabouts was.
Yes.
So now the masterminds are captured. Mustafa al-Hasnawi, Amr al-Baluchi, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi Binalshibh. Ironically enough, all these captures happened in Pakistan, no less. So there is some evidence to show that the ISI basically were either hiding these people out, just like they did with Ramzi Binalshibh, and just like they did with Bin Laden, and just like they did with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi Binalshibh. They're all captured, and they're all subsequently tortured brutally. I believe Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's waterboarded 183 times.
Something like that.
Ramzi Binalshibh, I think he's 71 or 82 times. The torture sessions, even with the lower ranking Al-Qaeda operatives like Abu Zubaydah, these people are just brutally tortured. Now, whatever they confess to is now contested in a court because their lawyers are basically chomping at the bit to basically go about with the trial saying that, hey, listen, these guys confessed to torture, and by law here, and especially in the United States, any information that's made under duress is not valid. Is that the reason why you think the trial has not started?
I do, and I think that I don't think a trial will ever take place. I honestly don't think a trial can ever take place, because how can America justify the only evidence they have is what they've got from him, from torture. Other than that, the only other evidence they have is what Yosri produced.
That's right.
Now, Yosri has been approached by the FBI. I know that. I know that, of course, I know that. He's been approached by them, and obviously he's unlikely ever to be agreeable to testify at a trial of somebody who's been tortured. Because how could any working journalist go into a court case in those circumstances? So I don't see what they can put in front of a jury, or even if there's no jury. I mean, whether it's a bunch of army colonels or whatever, I don't see they can put anything in front of them that has any credibility in terms of due process. And this is the most shocking mistake and most stupid mistake. I would personally imprison the people that did that. They are criminals in my view. It's shocking that they did it. It's shocking that it was allowed, because it destroyed the ability to have a decent outcome of this whole business. Undoubtedly, what they did is criminal. It's disgusting, and they should be punished for that. I don't agree with the death sentence, but they should spend the rest of their life, as undoubtedly they will, incarcerated. But we are all being denied the right to hear a free and open trial. And that is a crime in itself, that we've been denied that right, because we should all be able to hear them say what they did and to judge them on it in the full glare of publicity. And that's not going to be possible in my view. We're down to, how many in Guantanamo now? 25 or thereabouts, isn't it? I think, of which around about 5 or so are regarded as the big cheeses. I don't see any of those ever successfully completing their trials.
I've asked this question to a number of my guests on the show, and one of them was Ken Williams, who wrote, he's an FBI agent out of Arizona. He wrote what was infamously called the Phoenix Memo, which was warning about people flying in flight schools in Scottsdale, Arizona. I asked him that question. He basically said that he attended the initial court hearings of the Guantanamo 5. And he basically said, I asked him that question. He basically said no. And this is last year. And he said, he gave me the reason why. He said that he doesn't think that because of the torture sessions, that the case will just fall apart. And what will happen is that the United States is going to make a deal. Just 2 weeks ago, there's a story that's brokered now. The United States is basically in talks, doing a deal with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's lawyers about taking the death penalty off the table if they plead guilty to the crimes of 9/11. If that happens now, if this happens, the trial will no longer go forward. And whatever information and evidence that they had or didn't have now is not to the public. And also the biggest point, which you just raised, is that we'll never hear from the mouths of these people in what we should desperately want to hear. And we should hear it. We should hear it from them. And I think you similarly answered my next question, which is what I was going to build up to, was that would the video that Yosri Fouda take would not, that would be the nail in the coffin, wouldn't it be?
Totally would. And I remain hopeful that somehow, under some circumstances, that will come out. I think, I don't see why that should be hidden from humanity for the rest of whatever. It ought to come out. And that is an extremely important artifact, if I can put it that way, that should be in the public domain. There's no grounds now for keeping that secret. And it won't jeopardize the trial or anything else. And actually, it actually belongs to Yosri Fouda. Legally, in my view, it legally belongs to him. He's been denied access to something which was not provided to him, although it was promised that it would be, not by the Americans or anybody else, but by KSM and Ramzi themselves. So they acknowledge he set up the cameras, he supervised the rolling of those cameras. They then removed the cameras and promised him that they would give him an edited version back, which they never did. But I think those things, that's what was on KSM when he was arrested. That's what I believe. I believe that those films were with him when he was arrested.
Oh, okay. They were with him when he was arrested. Because
I think that's the closest I've got to it. I feel that that's the case. I've seen some suggestion of that, but it was either there or it would have been in Karachi, one place or the other.
Right, because according to the book, he basically wanted to keep the videos to edit out the faces.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. So, and I've always, when I read that book, it was monumental because I was like, my God, this should be like, I mean, I'll ask you the question. After the book is published, what was the reception?
Well, it was a very strong reception. I mean, it's been translated into 7 languages. It's been published in many, many countries. Always, I felt it wasn't. We didn't get the 5-star treatment because it was Yosri's name, and I feel there was a tremendous, as I said to you, tremendous resistance to giving the full credit to an Arab journalist. It's an extraordinary irony, isn't it, that it would be an Arab that broke the story of what really happened at 9/11, and nobody really wanted to admit that and allow that to sort of come out and hit you in the face. So I would say we were off the notch in terms of that. There would, I think in other circumstances, somebody would have optioned it for a film, because it's such an extraordinary story, Yosri's time. That's a classic movie. I've seen much weaker films made on the exploits of journalists, I can tell you. That's a real story, real danger, real jeopardy, a real big story at the bottom of it, etc., etc. So why didn't that happen? I don't know.
Has Yosri ever been contacted afterwards by anyone from Al-Qaeda itself since this happened?
Well, he was contacted by various people who were due to deliver the edited tapes to him. But as I said to you, whether they were then sort of freelancing and operating on their own terms, but they began asking for big sums of money, which Yosri had always made clear he would never pay a penny for anything. And so he refused to deal with them, and quite rightly, it would have been tainted if he'd done that anyway. So there were those contacts which went on for a while. I mean, 6 months or so, I think, afterwards. But then after that, it went quiet, and very little after that.
What was his reaction to the death of Bin Laden?
Actually, I can't really answer that question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, funnily enough, it was a surprising thing for me because I had been in that town just less than a year before he was killed. And then I began to wonder about whether I might be in trouble because somebody would say, what the was he doing there?
Yeah, right. It just so happens that he's killed and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is captured with Yosri Fouda interviewing him.
Yes, yeah. So I think, Yosri had no sympathy for Bin Laden. That kind of those kind of patrician Saudis, that particular kind of people, you know, they're not the warmest people in the world. They're not easy to relate to, I don't think. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I don't think he felt that this was a sympathetic person. You know, I think probably he believed, like a number of people, that he was easily manipulated by the Egyptians. It was the Egyptians who were the real guts of Al-Qaeda. They were the real militants. They had fought years and years against Sadat and all the rest of them, tried to kill Sadat, of course. They had fought very, very hard. And they had fought in Bosnia in particular. And that was an extremely, that was, I think, that was the kitchen where everything was heated up and warmed up and created. And they went from there, then to Sudan, and then finally to Afghanistan. But it was Bosnia, I think, that was the fundamental place for them, where they realized there was a kind of there was a strategy based on fighting groups that could fundamentally change the complexion of the Middle East in particular.
You know, I write about this sometimes. I do certain videos about how the influence of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was an organization based out of Cairo, Egypt, that was led by two individuals, Mohammad ibn al-Faraj and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And the ideology of bin Laden changed, because when Al-Qaeda was created, it wasn't an international terrorist organization, so to speak. They were training guerrilla tactics to Arab mujahideen fighting against the communists in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And it wasn't until the implementation of the Egyptians like Abu Hafs al-Masri and Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Ubaida al-Banshiri and all these hardline militants that came from Egypt to the Sudanese group, Al-Qaeda group. And then you started, you started noticing a change of more hardline militancy. And then in 1996, when bin Laden then relocated back to Afghanistan, then you noticed the first fatwa against the United States. And then in 1998, then, we started seeing the first
attacks in West Africa.
That's right, indeed.
Yeah.
The East Africa embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And then the second fatwa, which was the most important, the attacks on civilians anywhere you could find them.
These things grow out of the influence. Al-Masri in particular, I think, was a very, very important figure, just as important as Zawahiri himself, I think. And these people deeply impressed bin Laden, and they helped him formulate this kind of strategy of Al-Qaeda as an international outward-looking organization that was going to fundamentally change the world. And that was a massive jump. It was a massive jump from what they had done, as it were, they'd now had the experience of fighting in Afghanistan, of course, and claiming the victory. In Bosnia, where they had a certain amount of success. They weren't entirely successful, but they did a lot. And then back into Afghanistan and so forth, they had a lot of experience under their belts by this point. And they were no shortage of money, no shortage of recruits. They could do anything they want. And in a sense, KSM's appearance at that moment and the offer from him, I can do this big thing for you that'll really put you on the map. Suddenly, that was the right moment, the right man, the right place.
Exactly. And for those who are wondering, like, why is bin Laden attacking the United States? Why does Al-Qaeda continue to attack the United States? And bin Laden has given interviews to Peter Bergen of CNN and to John Miller of ABC News. He basically has, telling us that, it's our foreign policy with Saudi Arabia and Israel, the first Gulf War, the oil for food program, which 500,000 people were killed. And basically what he wanted to do was draw the United States into a similar version of what the Soviets went through in Afghanistan, to draw them into a long-out war, because they knew that Al-Qaeda could not beat the U.S. military. But what he could do is instigate them. And this is coming from his son. I think his son is Hamza bin Laden, one of the living sons. And he basically, I think it's Hamza bin Laden. I could be wrong about the name. Anyway, he basically told somebody from ABC News that when he bombed the East Africa embassies, he thought that the United States would over-exaggerate and extend into Afghanistan. And they didn't. And he complimented Clinton, saying that he wasn't as foolish and foolhardy. And then he decided, if we can't attack the United States will go to their country and attack them inside.
Yeah.
Right, directly. And that's when the planes operation began. And of course, you know, Bush basically gave him what he wanted and gave him more. Not only did we invade Afghanistan, but we gave him an added bonus. We invaded Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. And of course,
that was sadly, I mean, that was the most shameful and shocking outcome of all of this. Is that, and you know, I mean, the interesting question here is the extent to which, I mean, to what extent was the US intelligence industry, if you like, why did they think that attacking Iraq would solve the question of Al-Qaeda? How many of them really believe that that was the case? I mean, to me, it seemed quite a lot of them did. But, you know, I can tell you the extent. I mean, I pride myself in knowing what I'm talking about. You know, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East and in various places, and I've studied these things. I remember not long after the Americans invaded Iraq, hearing very senior people express surprise that there were Shias in Iraq, right? There was shock and consternation, and they didn't realize what do you mean? 50% of the population is, and those are the guys that benefited from Saddam Hussein being done in. Therefore, you know, the Sunnis had no leadership whatsoever. The only people that were kind of functioning because they had Iran close by were the Shias. Now, that level of ignorance played into the debacle that Iraq became eventually. And I still think about this, you know, just to what extent people really believed and were misled so much that they thought that, you know, you remember all this stuff about Mohammad Atta being in Czechoslovakia and money being handed over from various, from Saddam Hussein. It was all garbage. It was a total garbage. I spent months and months investigating all these stories from the Sunday Times and realized every time you got anywhere near anything, it crumbled. And that, you know, there was no connection. There was no, you know, the whole story about uranium. Do you remember all that yellow cake uranium and everything else? And all of these kind of, all the stuff about weapons of mass destruction. But primarily the first thing is we're going to attack Iraq because they back Al-Qaeda and they're sort of, they're baddies in that respect. That was such foolishness. And anybody who knew anything about these things knew that. We all knew that. Anybody who was in the know knew this was completely stupid and foolish. But, you know, how you explain how these massive misconceptions take place is another matter altogether. I think that's a very interesting subject.
Yeah, it's a real, I mean, the whole Iraq issue was a crime in itself, basically. I mean, if the United States was honest and they were co-signers of, say, the Rome Statutes, for example, we would be held liable for crimes against humanity.
Indeed.
Just based on Iraq alone.
Yeah.
But it didn't end there, because under the Obama administration, we saw the extension into Libya and then Syria, of course, with the CIA operation Timber Sycamore, where we're funding jihadists in Syria to overthrow Assad. And it just seems like the United States made things worse in the Middle East overall.
Yeah, I would say so. There's some terrible, terrible mistakes. And it's hard to understand because it's not as if they benefited.
Right,
you know, sometimes you can do things because you're doing it for pure material gain of some kind, you know, but there was none of that. Actually, this debilitated America to some degree. You know, the cost in men and material, if I can put it that way, was so huge and substantial and shameful, really.
But there's a lot, you know, not to sound too conspiratorial, but I mean, there's some hint of truth to this too, is that the United States are basically persuaded by lobbyists such as the Gulf lobby and the Israeli lobby to do like the biddings of certain people that want to see their preconceived enemies destroyed in the region. And then of course, you got the Pentagon, the issue of wanting to continue war to keep going. I mean, we're seeing that in Ukraine with Russia in itself. That's a mess too in itself. It just seems that all of these conflicts basically come at the disposal of the people themselves, and most people don't want war.
No, I think that's entirely true. That's a much bigger discussion, I guess.
Right.
And I think it's probably beyond this discussion, but it's nonetheless a fascinating discussion. But I was very struck by initially, I mean, the lack of knowledge, the general simple lack of basic facts, because if you don't understand that half the Iraqi population is the same religion and co-religionists of the people next door in Iran who are your deadly enemies, and you've just put them in power, and that's, you know, I mean, this is just like dumb, you know, and yet I don't believe this was I don't think this was done for a reason, a logical reason. It's done because of lack of knowledge. That's the point here. It's lack of knowledge. It's stupidity, ignorance. It's from the fact that policymakers, whoever they may be, the military guys or State Department or whoever, are not aware of how things actually work on the ground. And this, I would rather believe that than believe that this is a conspiracy. Let me put it that way to you.
Right, and you know what? There's a lot of truth to that, because I'll give you an example. Because the CIA basically were tasked to find weapons of mass destruction relating to Al-Qaeda and the Ba'athist Army, and they could not. Yeah. And basically what happened was they facilitated evidence. I think they captured an individual by the name of Ibn Sheikh al-Libby, and yes, they tortured him. And he basically told them that, yes, you know, there was chemical and biological weapons between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. And then Secretary of State Colin Powell brought that to light in the United Nations Security Council. And that's infamously why we went to war with Iraq. And when they went to interview al-Libby later on, when the war's right in the middle of being, when it started, they said, well, why did you lie to us? He goes, I only told you to stop the torture. So, yes. And then, you know, 3 months later, they found him hanging in a cell in, I think, Egypt. So I'm like, you know, you know, the truth comes out sooner or later about all the lies that these people basically partook, especially with Iraq in itself. And I'm not really usually surprised, but I'm aghast that neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and all these people who probably never visited Iraq ever before can basically say what to do and how to conduct a war on a country like that, and don't even know the culture itself. I mean, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, they basically, Paul L. Pearl Bremer, who's an extension of the State Department, was in charge of the Iraqi Provisional Orders 1 and 2, which basically dissoluded the army and the law enforcement. And the country went into anarchy, basically. And
well, they immediately went and joined the jihadist organizations with their weapons.
Right. They basically, that's what they joined, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they basically, the jihadists took advantage of the situation, and it created a vacuum. And of course, what did we see? The Islamic State of Iraq, which
that was
ISIS.
Of Iraq. Right. That was how ISIS was created. Yeah,
that's
from the prison camps. The camps that were set up in the south of Iraq after the invasion. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who's basically a Jordanian prisoner who built a camp in Iraq, and you know, just like that. I mean, overnight. You know,
he didn't have to train anybody because they were all highly experienced army officers that had spent years fighting the Iranians on a First World War battlefield. They knew everything about tactics and weaponry and everything else. So they didn't have to train anybody. They were falling over each other. There were so many people that wanted to join them.
Oh, it's a shock that the United States allowed for this to happen, and then not when the anarchies, you know, when the army and law enforcement were dissoluded, the U.S. military had no answer for it. And you wonder, like, what was the plan anyway? The long-term plan? Maybe there wasn't any. And basically, it would fit right into your statement about the ignorance and arrogance of American foreign policy in this country. Nick, what projects are you currently working on now?
Well, I said to you, I'm primarily writing about Central Asia and what I call the Great Steppe. And I've just written a history of the Great Steppe. And that's I'm off to Kazakhstan next week because they've just translated into Kazakh. And it's being published there, and so I'm very proud of that because you know, nomad societies don't generally have a written history, and what they've got, most of them, even the Mongols, the Kazakhs, and all these people, their history has been given to them by the Russians. So I provided an alternative discourse to their history, and I think they really appreciate that, and that's why it's been taken up so well there. And you know, this is a national event; it'll be on TV news and everything else. So I'm very proud of that, and so I'm doing a lot of work on that now. I'm not doing so much of the investigations that I've done most of my life because, well, hey, you know, I want to do what I want to do primarily, and you know, I've a great love for Central Asia. You know, I travel there in remote places on horseback every year normally, excluding the COVID years. I go on expeditions, just 6 or 8 people for weeks at a time into places, untracked places really. And that's what I enjoy doing. And I realize there's a history of this, and I've tried to explore that as well. So what comes out after that, who knows? But as long as I can keep on sitting on a horse, I will continue doing those kind of travels because they give me huge pleasure. And you know, I've always found, actually, you know, all the work I've done throughout my career, strangely enough, with BCCI, I was working on BCCI from at least 9 months before the bank collapsed. Nobody knew it was going to collapse. I didn't know it was going to collapse, but I had started to hear all sorts of strange stories about that bank, and I began to work on it. And when it did collapse, I was like streets ahead of everybody. I knew everything about it. I knew who all the officials were. I knew about the legal cases in Miami that they had been involved in. And the Bank of England regulators here knew nothing about any of this. And I've always worked on stories without a commission or anything else, you know, stuff that I've worked on, and then it's found its place. And this is the way in which I've worked through most of my life. And it works well for me. I'm good at spotting certain anomalies and things and accumulating. I'm a classic researcher in that sense. I accumulate stuff, I order it, I get it very straight in my mind. And then if I'm lucky, I get a break. And you know, as long as you can seize the moment, that works really well. So that's the kind of technique I've always used, and it's stood me in good stead. When I started traveling to Central Asia, it was simply to fulfill my desire to travel in remote places. I've now had 4 books or 5 books out of that in the last 2 years. And more to come, I'm sure of that. But what comes out after that, I don't know. It'll be something else that takes my fancy and draws me in that direction.
And you said you still keep in contact with Yosri Fouda.
Yeah, very closely. I was with him. I meet him regularly, and I talked to him, and we were speaking yesterday. Yeah. And
he is he working on any projects at all?
No, he's not. No, and he's kind of resistant to doing so. I think he feels like he's had a really tough time over all this. It's been tough on him as well, actually, because you know, when you're in that position and when you know what you've done and everything else, there's a big load to carry with you. So I think he feels quite a lot of that, and I understand that entirely.
Well, I know it may not mean much for me, but you know, I have a big thank you between you and Yosri and what you've done writing this book, and it's a real pleasure to basically understand what you guys had went through regarding this situation, regarding this experience. And Yosri Fouda himself, you know, I'm indebted to him, and I thank him very much, and I thank you for basically writing the book and basically making it available for people to basically show. Here we have 2 of the biggest minds regarding the worst terrorist attack in the United States history, and we would not have known this had we had not that book, had we not had that interview. We would leave it up to the CIA to tell us the story, and they're basically not telling us anything.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
I thank you very much.
Well, I would urge you in response, Adam, to continue to press for Yosri's film. Right? They've got no reason to hold that, and someone has got it. I am 100% sure of that. And you never know. You may be the guy that breaks that one. And good luck to you if you do. But that's, to me, is one of the big sort of legacy stories remaining from 9/11, because whenever it comes out, if that comes out, that will be sensational. It will be totally sensational to see those 2 guys in their pomp talking about what they did. That will be amazing, and we all deserve to be able to see that. I think it will put everything in its place. And actually, you know, if the agencies in the States were a bit smarter, they would realize that themselves.
Nick Fielding, co-author of Masterminds of Terror. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam.